When the call came, I almost didn't answer. My phone buzzed on the counter, and when I saw my mother's name flashing on the screen, a familiar heaviness settled in my chest. It wasn't just the years of neglect that made me hesitate. It was the certainty that she only ever reached out when she wanted something. But curiosity won over, and I swiped to answer. Her voice carried that false sweetness I had grown to resent. She asked how I was, but it was clear she didn't actually care. After few pleasantries, she cut straight to the point, and her words were like a slap to the face. My parents wanted me to share my inheritance with Ryan. The same Ryan who had been the golden child all my life, who had been gifted a vacation home when I was drowning in medical bills, and who had never once lifted a finger to help me when I needed it most. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white as her words sank in. My parents had refused to help me when I faced the lowest point of my life, citing financial constraints. Yet they had somehow found the means to buy Ryan a luxurious property as a gift for his growing family. Now, years later, with the ink barely dry on my inheritance papers, they were asking me to hand over a portion to the very person who had been handed everything on a silver platter. Memories surged forward unbidden. I was 26 when I received my diagnosis. The treatments were grueling and expensive, and insurance only covered a fraction. I had reached out to my parents, desperate for help, but they had brushed me off with excuses. They had their own financial priorities, my mother had said. Shortly after, I discovered what those priorities were when Ryan posted gleeful photos of his new beach house online, a gift from Mom and Dad. I had been left to fend for myself, relying on loans, working exhausting hours between treatments, and leaning on the kindness of friends. My parents hadn't even visited me in the hospital. Ryan, of course, had been too busy enjoying his well-earned vacations to so much as send a text. Now, here they were, demanding that I do the right thing and share my inheritance. They spoke of family unity and how Ryan's children could benefit from the money. It was almost laughable. My inheritance wasn't some random windfall. It was a trust from my late grandmother, who had seen through my parents' favoritism and ensured that I would have some financial stability. That money was meant for me, to secure the future I had fought so hard for. Anger simmered just beneath the surface as my mother prattled on about fairness and duty. Each word stung, a reminder of every slight and betrayal I had endured. I wanted to scream, to unleash years of pent-up resentment, but I forced myself to stay calm. Losing my temper would only validate their belief that I was the difficult one. Instead, I listened. I let her lay out her reasons, each one more absurd than the last. She painted Ryan as a struggling father who just needed a little help. I knew better. Ryan's struggles were self-inflicted. He had squandered countless opportunities, always knowing that Mom and Dad would bail him out. And now they expected me to do the same. When she finally paused, I gave a measured response. I told her I would think about it. That seemed to appease her, and she ended the call, confident that I would see reason. But as I set the phone down, my resolve hardened. I wasn't going to cave. Not this time. For once in my life, I would stand my ground. The silence in my apartment was deafening after the call ended. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. The nerve of them to even ask. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle. This wasn't about family or fairness. It was about enabling Ryan yet again. They hadn't cared about fairness when I was barely scraping by. They hadn't cared about family when I was battling for my life without their support. A wave of determination washed over me. I wasn't the same person I had been years ago, desperate for their approval. I had learned to survive on my own, to build a life despite their indifference. If they thought I would roll over and give up what little security I had, they were sorely mistaken. For years, I had allowed them to dictate the narrative, to paint me as the problem child while Ryan basked in their adoration. But not anymore. This was my chance to reclaim my voice, to draw a line in the sand. The trust my grandmother had left me wasn't just money. It was her way of acknowledging the injustice I had endured. It was her silent vote of confidence in me. I knew the days ahead would be difficult. My parents weren't going to take no for an answer, and Ryan would undoubtedly play the victim. But I was ready. I had spent my whole life fighting battles alone. This was just one more to add to the list. And this time, I was determined to win. That night, sleep was out of reach. I lay in the darkness, my mind racing as it sifted through years of memories I'd tried to bury. Every slight, every moment of favoritism played like a cruel highlight reel in my head. I could almost hear my parents' voices echoing with excuses for why Ryan deserved more. The image of him at 17 with the keys to a brand new car still stung. My parents had presented it to him as a reward for simply existing. Meanwhile, I had been working part-time at a diner, saving every penny just to afford a clunker that broke down every other week. They called it teaching me responsibility. To Ryan, they gave freedom. To me, they gave lectures. Then there were the private lessons. Ryan had once expressed a passing interest in playing the guitar, and within days, my parents had hired a top-tier instructor. His enthusiasm fizzled out after a few months, but the effort they had poured into nurturing his hobbies had been undeniable. When I'd begged to join a local art class, the answer was no. They couldn't afford it, they said, though somehow they always managed to afford Ryan's whims. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern, a lifetime of being told, without words, that I was less. And when I dared to bring it up, their response had been maddeningly consistent. My mother would tell me I was stronger than Ryan, more independent, as if that justified the blatant disparity. They hadn't denied neglecting me. They'd framed it as a compliment. For years, I had swallowed their reasoning. I had convinced myself that resilience was something to be proud of, that needing less made me better. But as I stared at the ceiling, those words felt like chains rather than badges of honor. Their praise for my strength had been a smokescreen, a way to excuse their choices without acknowledging the harm they caused. I had built my life on scraps, carving out a semblance of stability through sheer determination. But the cost of that independence had been steep. I had spent countless nights crying over bills I couldn't pay, working through illnesses because missing a shift meant falling behind. My parents had never seen any of that. Or worse, they had seen it and chosen to ignore it. Ryan, by contrast, had been coddled into helplessness. Every time he failed, my parents were there to cushion the blow. Every bad decision he made was met with support rather than consequences. And now, as a father himself, he had become a reflection of their enabling. He expected the world to bend to his needs because it always had. The realization hit me like a freight train. My parents didn't see the world the way I did. To them, Ryan's needs were paramount, his failures forgivable. My struggles, however, were invisible, even when they were glaringly obvious. The chasm between their perception of us was too vast to bridge. For them, Ryan was the child to nurture. I was the child who could endure. As the hours ticked by, my resolve hardened. They wanted me to give up a part of my inheritance, not because it was fair or right, but because it was convenient. Sharing it with Ryan wouldn't fix the imbalance of our childhoods. It wouldn't make up for the years I had spent scraping by while he thrived on their generosity. It would only reinforce the dynamic that had defined our family for decades. I couldn't allow it. This wasn't just about money. It was about drawing a line, about refusing to play the role they had assigned me. My inheritance was a lifeline, a chance to build a future without the shadow of their neglect looming over me. Giving it away would be a betrayal of everything I had fought for. As if on cue, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't need to look to know it was my mother. Her timing was uncanny, as though she could sense the shift in my mindset. The message was exactly what I expected, a carefully worded guilt trip about family loyalty and the importance of sacrifice. She painted Ryan as a devoted father trying to make ends meet, conveniently ignoring the fact that his struggles were self-inflicted. My stomach churned as I read her words. She wasn't asking for help. She was demanding compliance. Her message dripped with the same entitlement that had characterized her relationship with Ryan. She saw my inheritance as an extension of the family pot, something she had a right to distribute as she saw fit. But this time, I wasn't going to let her dictate the terms. I put the phone down without responding. Letting her words fester would only give her more power over me. I needed to stay focused on what mattered, protecting what was mine and standing up for myself, even if it meant alienating the people who were supposed to love me. The night stretched on, and sleep never came. But as the first rays of sunlight crept through the blinds, I felt a strange sense of clarity. My mother would escalate, I had no doubt. She would use every tool in her arsenal to wear me down. But I was ready. For once in my life, I was prepared to choose myself, no matter the cost. The knock at my door came mid-morning, sharp and deliberate. I knew who it was before I even looked through the peephole. My parents had never been ones for subtlety, and after the previous night's barrage of messages, it was only a matter of time before they escalated. Opening the door, I was met with my mother's tight-lipped smile and my father's uncomfortable shuffle. They didn't wait for an invitation, stepping inside as if their presence was a given. I felt the familiar wave of frustration building. This wasn't a visit to talk, it was a coordinated ambush. They didn't waste time. My mother started in with her rehearsed lines about family and sacrifice, her voice dripping with a mix of feigned concern and condescension. My father added his occasional nods, a silent prop to her performance. They framed their plea around Ryan, detailing his financial woes as though I hadn't heard it all before. Their words were a tangle of justification, painting my brother as a victim of circumstance rather than the architect of his own problems. I listened, letting them dig their hole deeper until I couldn't stomach another word. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady, but laced with the anger that had been simmering for years. I laid out the facts, recounting every instance of neglect, every moment they had prioritized Ryan's comfort over my survival. I didn't sugarcoat it, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of discomfort in my mother's eyes. My father, however, remained impassive, as if he'd heard it all before and dismissed it. They tried to interrupt, to spin their narrative, but I wouldn't let them. I reminded them of the countless times I had begged for help, only to be met with excuses about financial constraints, excuses that had never applied to Ryan. I pointed out the absurdity of asking me to share an inheritance that was rightfully mine, given to me by a grandmother who had seen through their favoritism. Their response was predictable. My mother shifted tactics, her voice taking on a wounded edge as she accused me of being ungrateful, of turning my back on family in their time of need. My father's silence became complicit, his refusal to challenge her words reinforcing the narrative she was building. But I didn't waver. For every manipulative statement she made, I countered with cold, undeniable truth. When it became clear they weren't going to get what they wanted, my mother's frustration boiled over. She left with a final parting shot about how I'd regret my selfishness, while my father muttered something about family unity before trailing after her. The door closed behind them, but the weight of the encounter lingered. I thought that would be the end of it, but a few hours later, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. Ryan. I hesitated before answering, knowing full well this wasn't going to be an apology or an olive branch. Still, curiosity got the better of me. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as he launched into what I could only describe as a performance. He acknowledged our parents' favoritism, but only in the vaguest terms, framing it as a misunderstanding rather than a pattern of deliberate neglect. Then came the pivot. He spoke about his children, how the inheritance could help them, as if that somehow made it my responsibility. He threw in a half-hearted apology, a token effort to appear conciliatory, before circling back to his main point, how sharing the money was the decent thing to do. I listened in silence, letting him run out of steam. When I finally spoke, my words were measured but unyielding. I dismantled his arguments piece by piece, pointing out the entitlement that underpinned his entire plea. I reminded him that my inheritance wasn't a communal pot for the family to dip into whenever they saw fit. It was mine, earned through years of struggle and resilience, and I wasn't going to let anyone guilt me into giving it up. The conversation ended with him calling me heartless, his tone dripping with indignation. It was a word I'd heard before, one my parents had often used when I dared to set boundaries. But this time, it didn't sting. If protecting what was mine made me heartless in their eyes, so be it. The fallout came swiftly. Within days, my mother had reached out to every relative within earshot, spinning a tale of my supposed greed and ingratitude. She painted Ryan as the struggling hero and me as the villain, a selfish daughter who refused to help her own family. The phone calls and messages from cousins and aunts started pouring in, each one laced with thinly veiled judgment. At first, I felt the familiar pang of isolation, the creeping doubt that maybe I was in the wrong. But then I remembered all the times I had been left to fend for myself while they rallied around Ryan. I wasn't the villain in this story. I was the scapegoat refusing to play my part. Fueled by a mix of anger and clarity, I took to social media. I wrote a post that was raw and honest, laying out the truth in stark detail. I described the years of favoritism, the neglect, and the burden of having to build a life without the support my brother had taken for granted. I didn't name names, but the message was clear. To my surprise, the response was overwhelmingly supportive. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, some sharing their own experiences of being overlooked or dismissed by my parents. Even a few of the family members who had initially criticized me began to reconsider, their opinions shifting as they saw the bigger picture. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. My parents' narrative was unraveling, and with it, the power they had held over me for so long. The fallout wasn't over, but I was no longer afraid of it. I had found my voice, and I wasn't going to let them silence it again. The tension came to a head when Susan and Robert delivered their ultimatum. They arrived unannounced again, their expressions a mixture of determination and disdain. This wasn't a conversation, it was a declaration. Either I helped Ryan, or I would be cut off from the family. The words hung heavy in the air, their implications clear. It was manipulation at its most blatant, and they expected me to crumble under the weight of their demand. But I didn't. I stood firm, my response calm and deliberate. I told them I had made my decision and that their threats wouldn't change it. Their faces fell, first in disbelief, then in anger. My mother's voice cracked as she accused me of tearing the family apart. My father's silence was deafening, his avoidance of my gaze speaking volumes. Yet, even as they stormed out, slamming the door behind them, I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. For the first time, I had chosen myself over their approval. The fallout was swift. Days later, a letter arrived from my father. His handwriting was shaky, the words uneven, as though written in haste. He revealed something I hadn't expected. My mother was ill. He didn't go into detail, but the tone of his plea was unmistakable. He wanted reconciliation, for the family to come together in her time of need. Reading the letter left me torn. I had every reason to walk away, to protect the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. But the idea of my mother being sick, no matter how strained our relationship, stirred something deep within me. I wrestled with the memories of her neglect and favoritism, contrasting them with fleeting moments of care from my childhood. It was a storm of emotions I couldn't easily navigate. As I mulled over the letter, another development unfolded. Ryan had uncovered a clause in our grandparents' will, one that entitled him to a separate inheritance, contingent upon a single condition. He had to maintain steady employment for a full year. The condition was simple, almost laughably so, yet it was a monumental challenge for someone like Ryan, who had coasted through life on others' generosity. At first, he tried to meet the requirement, taking on a job at a local business. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might actually rise to the occasion. But old habits die hard. Within weeks, he began skipping shifts, citing excuses that ranged from family obligations to minor inconveniences. His employer's patience wore thin, and before the month was over, he was let go. Watching from a distance, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to step in, to guide him as an older sibling might. But the larger part of me knew that any help I offered would only perpetuate the cycle. Ryan needed to face the consequences of his choices, just as I had faced mine. The pattern repeated itself. Ryan would find another job, start strong, and then falter. Each failure was met with frustration and blame, directed at everyone but himself. He accused our parents of setting him up to fail, of not providing enough support. He even tried to pin some of the responsibility on me, as if my refusal to share my inheritance had somehow sabotaged his efforts. Through it all, I maintained my distance, I had spent enough of my life cleaning up after others, sacrificing my own well-being to keep the peace. This time, I let the chips fall where they may. It wasn't easy to watch, but it was necessary. Ryan needed to learn that entitlement wasn't a substitute for accountability. As weeks turned into months, my mother's illness became a more pressing concern. My father's letters continued, each one more desperate than the last. He spoke of family unity, of the importance of forgiveness, but his words felt hollow. They were pleas for comfort rather than genuine attempts to address the years of harm that had been done. I could see the pattern repeating itself, an expectation that I would set aside my needs to fix what was broken. In the quiet moments, I reflected on my journey. I thought about the nights I had spent alone, fighting to build a life from the ground up. I thought about the strength it had taken to say no, to stand firm in the face of relentless pressure. And I thought about my grandmother, whose foresight had given me the tools to carve out a future on my terms. Choosing myself hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. For the first time, I felt free from the weight of their expectations. The guilt that had once consumed me was now a faint whisper, easily silenced by the knowledge that I was finally living for myself. The final weeks of the year brought clarity. Ryan's attempts to meet the will's condition had failed, leaving him without the inheritance he had counted on. My parents' ultimatum had faded into the background, their threats of estrangement losing their power in the face of my unwavering resolve. And though my mother's illness weighed heavily on my mind, I knew that reconciliation couldn't come at the expense of my peace. I made my decision, not out of spite or anger, but out of a deep understanding of what I needed to move forward. My father's letters remained unanswered, not because I didn't care, but because I couldn't return to a dynamic that had caused me so much pain. For once, I was choosing to prioritize my well-being over their demands. Life began to shift in ways I hadn't fully anticipated once I claimed my inheritance. For the first time in years, I wasn't drowning under the weight of financial strain. I paid off the mountain of debt I had accumulated during my health crisis, each cleared balance a tangible reminder of my resilience. With a clean slate, I started focusing on my dream, launching a business I had been quietly building in my mind for years. The process wasn't easy. Every step required meticulous planning and countless hours of work, but the results were worth it. My small business flourished, gaining traction far faster than I had expected. It wasn't just about the financial success, it was the symbolism. This was mine, built from my determination and supported by the inheritance my grandmother had entrusted to me. It was proof that I could thrive without relying on anyone else. Meanwhile, my family's world began to unravel. Ryan's failures had compounded, and his financial irresponsibility caught up to him. The vacation home, the prized gift from my parents that had once been a source of envy, was sold off to cover mounting debts. The very symbol of my parents' favoritism became a casualty of their blind indulgence. The shift in our family dynamic didn't go unnoticed by extended relatives. The smear campaign my mother had orchestrated against me began to backfire as the truth of their favoritism became evident. The facade they had built, of a perfect family with Ryan at the center, started to crumble. It wasn't out of spite that I shared my side of the story, but I wasn't going to stay silent while they painted me as the villain. The final attempt at reconciliation came from my father. He reached out one last time, his voice heavy with weariness and regret. He didn't try to justify their actions this time. Instead, he spoke of wanting to mend the fractures in our family, of rebuilding something that had long been broken. It was a plea that might have moved me years ago, but now it only deepened my resolve. I didn't answer. Not because I lacked compassion, but because I had found something more valuable than their approval: my peace. Reopening that chapter would only invite more pain, more manipulation. My father's words lingered, but they didn't sway me. I had given enough of myself to a family that had taken me for granted. It was time to let go. In the quiet moments that followed, I reflected on the true meaning of family. It wasn't about blood ties or shared history. It was about the people who supported you, who saw your worth without conditions. For too long, I had equated loyalty with sacrifice, but now I understood the difference. My grandmother had been the one to truly see me, to give me the tools to build a life unburdened by others' expectations. Her gift was more than money, it was freedom. As I embraced this new chapter, I found myself surrounded by a chosen family of friends and mentors who celebrated my success without envy or demands. They were the kind of people I had always hoped my parents would be, unwavering in their support, genuine in their care. Looking back, the journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. I had faced betrayal, manipulation, and loss, yet I had emerged stronger, more certain of who I was and what I deserved. My inheritance had been the catalyst, but the true change had come from within. I had learned to value myself, to stand firm in my boundaries, and to let go of relationships that no longer served me. In the end, I didn't need their approval. I had found something far more precious, a life that was entirely my own. And for the first time, I felt free.